This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. An artist may paint on any number of materials: canvas, wood, paper, or even metal. And in the case of this little painting, a sheet of copper. Or at least it was a sheet before it was crudely turned into a piece of origami. And the issues facing this painting are very obvious. The creases are horrible. The copper has been distorted and damaged, and the paint layer has begun separating from the copper. All of this makes it impossible to see the image. All we can see are the problems, and this takes away the magic from the artist and interferes with our experience of being with the art. Now, this isn't my first piece of copper, but they are always interesting and challenging because unlike canvas and wood, moisture, heat, and pressure are ineffective at removing distortions. And because it's a non-porous material, it will not absorb adhesives, making stabilization unique. Many of the issues that this painting faces are patently obvious, but I suspect, as I spend more time with this piece, more issues will present themselves as I embark upon reverse origami. My fears about what I might find when unfolding this painting are based in the past and all of the surprises I've come across. And I wonder what it would be like if maybe it was done right the first time, like with Squarespace. And it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. 1. Find your domain name. If you don't have one already, you can look one up and purchase it right through Squarespace's website. If you already have a domain, you can transfer it over to Squarespace, where they offer competitive pricing and seamless integration with their web platform. 2. Choose your template. You can select from one of Squarespace's thousands of professionally designed templates that work anywhere from desktops to tablets, even mobile devices, so your visitors get a unified, complete experience no matter where they are. No coding required. 3, and this is the fun one, filling it up with whatever you like. Now, you are probably going to run into some questions along the way. This is a big project after all, and this is where Squarespace shines. They have webinars, online articles, how-to guides, and videos walking you through how to do just about everything on their sites. And if you still need a little bit more help, well, there's a robust forum of people just like you using Squarespace that are happy to jump in and give you a hand. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Looking at this painting, well, it doesn't look good. The paint is cracked and lifting, but curiously, it's really flexible. Generally, oil paint of significant age is not this flexible. It's very brittle. That's one of the reasons it cracks on canvas. But here, it's really flexible, and that's really curious to me. And I'll have to learn about this painting a little bit more as the process goes on. But for right now, I have to start focusing on the panel itself, this piece of copper, and figuring out how I'm going to flatten it. Then the first thing I'm going to do is try to stabilize any of the areas of lifting paint. And I'm using an heat-activated and solvent-activated adhesive. I've thinned this out quite a bit so that it can pass through the needle, and I'm just injecting it in, under, around, on top of, in the neighborhood of, vicinity of all of this lifting paint. I want to make sure that I get enough adhesive so that the paint can get bonded back down to the copper when that time comes. And I'm not terribly concerned about being neat here. Even if I get adhesive on the surface, I can remove this because it's a conservation grade adhesive designed to be removable. But using the needle does give me a little bit more precision, and it allows me to get underneath the areas that really aren't lifting that much that maybe a brush wouldn't reach. And you can see I am making a pretty big mess of this, but like I said, I'll clean up all of this stuff later on. For now, we're just worried about stabilizing this lifting paint so that it doesn't come off during the handling process. And surprisingly, for a little painting, it takes a lot of adhesive and a lot of time to get it all stabilized. And then once all the adhesive has been applied, I need to let it dry, and that takes anywhere from an hour to 3, but I'm going to give it a full day and come back fresh with my eye on the copper. Now you'll see some interesting tools that I have here, particularly a heat gun. But I'm going to start with a piece of siliconized mylar. This is non-stick so that nothing on the painting will stick to anything. I'll flip the painting over, and then I'll take that heat gun and start applying some heat to the copper. Now copper is a soft, pliable metal, particularly when it's this thin, and when we warm it up, even just a little bit, it becomes more responsive to manipulation. And that's really important because I don't want to damage this copper, and I also am hoping that the little heat that I'm applying, keeping it under about 130 degrees and constantly checking with an infrared thermometer, will allow the paint layer to be a little bit more receptive to manipulation and bending. Once the heat is applied, I'll put the felt on the copper to protect my hands and simply press it and hope that the copper responds. It's not a terribly scientific process, but you can see it worked, at least for that first crease. For this corner, which is actually more heavily creased than the main body of the copper, again, I'm applying some heat, checking it with the infrared thermometer. I don't want to get too hot here, not only for my hands, but I also don't want to cook the copper and the paint. And then I'll press it. And it will flatten up, quite a bit in fact. Just with hand pressure, evenly applied over and over again, I can remove almost the entire crease. But there is still a little bit of spring back. The metal does retain a memory, so I'm not completely done. And I'll continue focusing on this main crease, pressing it out, but eventually the pressing is no longer effective. So I will turn to just manipulating the copper free without a surface onto which I'm pressing it, adding heat, and then just bending it with my hands and hoping that I can remove all of these distortions. Now once I reach a point of diminishing returns, I'll turn to a new set of tools, hammers and a dolly. Now hammer and dolly is something that is used a lot in metal shaping and metalworking, and I'm going to take that technique and apply it here. Generally, when one is shaping metal, steel or aluminum or other metals, there is a lot of force being used. Here I am going to use almost no force. I'm going to apply some heat into this copper, and then once I'm satisfied with its temperature, again checking it with the thermometer, I'll take my hammer and very, very gently tap on the copper. And I'm barely using the weight of the hammer, just trying to put some force into and through the copper. The steel plate, the dolly below, will absorb the force from the hammer and help flatten out the copper. And you can see I'm barely hammering here because this is a painting, not a sheet of metal. And if I hammer hard, I could detach or break or just damage the paint layer, and I don't want to do that. So I'm working very, very gingerly, slowly adding heat, checking it, and then very lightly tapping on this copper with the hammer. And I thought about all the different ways that I could manipulate this copper, putting it in a flat press, putting it under weights, rolling it through a press, but ultimately I figured that doing it by hand was probably the safest and actually most effective way of getting these dents and ripples and creases out of the copper. You know, sometimes you have a tool that might be the right tool, but this is the wrong application. And so using a roller or a press or something like that, I feared would put too much stress on the paint surface and even the copper itself and might distort it or cause damage that was unnecessary. And even though this is a slow-going process and the gains are really minimal, I'm okay with how much time it takes. This is not a rush. I don't need to finish anytime soon. I can take my time and do it slowly and correctly. Now with the painting finally flat, I can take a look at it under UV, and right off the bat, circled in red here, we can see some old retouching. That's pretty clear. It fluoresces pretty strongly. But there are other areas where the paint's lost. Up here in yellow, I'm circling this section where nothing is fluorescing. Now we know that there is lost paint there. We can see the divot. Same thing on the right side here. But not being able to see the retouching fluoresce makes me worried that this is a masking varnish and that there is trouble beneath. But for now, I still have some more work to do before I can think about what's lying beneath that varnish. Remember I injected that adhesive to stabilize the paint? Well, now I'm going to activate it on the hot table. You see, once the adhesive dries and the solvent evaporates, we're left with just adhesive, but we need to activate it with heat. So putting the painting on the hot table and bringing it up to temperature will activate that adhesive, and then as the adhesive cools and dries, it will bond the lifting and loose paint back down to the copper. This is effectively the same thing that I do with canvases when I do an adhesive impregnation, but here I applied the adhesive from the front underneath the lifting paint as opposed to on the back through the canvas. Now, I'm using a little wood roller here just to make sure that I get all of the excess adhesive oozing out. You can see it on the surface. It's a little bit brighter or shinier. And then I'll come with a bone folder to do the same. Once the painting's been brought up to temperature, I'll let it heat soak, then I'll cool it, and then I can remove it from the hot table. Unlike a canvas, this piece does not need to rest under weights. We haven't introduced any moisture, and copper is not going to hold on to any ambient moisture. So once it's cool, we're ready to go start cleaning this painting. And that is where I'm worried that things are going to get interesting. And by interesting, I don't mean fun and novel and in a good way. I mean interesting like somebody did something to this piece and now I'm going to have to figure out how to correct it. Because let's be honest, that's what happens. I made some tests and I determined that I was going to need a solvent gel to soften up this adhesive. It wasn't responsive to most of the solvents that I have. And in fact, even the gel isn't terribly effective at removing this coating, which is supporting evidence for some tomfoolery happening. Now, after letting the gel sit for a little bit, I can take a paintbrush that I've cut short and just start agitating that gel to lift off some of this coating. But it's not complete. You see, the coating isn't just dissolving like a varnish layer would. It's coming off, but in bits and pieces and irregularly. So this is really frustrating. Clearly somebody applied something on here to hide the fact that there was a lot of retouching or additional work done to it. It prevented the UV light from penetrating through and effectively hid all of their work. And on top of it, which this is non-reversible, I'm able to remove it through some extra means, like using a solvent gel and then ultimately my scalpel. But this isn't good work. Once I've removed all of the solvent gel, I can come back with my scalpel and start scraping off the remnants. And ultimately what I discover is that the solvent gel just softens it up enough that I can scrape it off without damaging the paint layer. But this is slow going and really, really frustrating. Nobody likes to find this type of work on a painting that comes into the studio. Eventually though, I am able to get off all of this surface coating, and what we see underneath is actually a pretty nice painting. At least based on this one hand, I'm assuming the rest is as nice. There's a pretty big change in the color from prior to scraping and post scraping. But there is a lot of work ahead of me. So just like I did with the hand, I'll apply the solvent gel to a small area, let it sit, remove it, and then come back with my scalpel and scrape off all of that coating. Now, luckily for me and for the client, this is a very, very small painting. It's very, very small. If this were a gigantic painting, we might be having a different conversation because, of course, the amount of time it takes to scrape this all off is just incredible. And that's where a ton of labor is involved, and that's where the cost can get really expensive. And for some clients, cost doesn't matter. They love their pieces and they want them conserved. But for others, there's a realistic return on investment that they need to calculate. And so for some of them, this might not be tolerable. But the change certainly is worth it. As I start to remove all of this surface coating, we can see the really beautiful colors underneath. The face is just coming alive. So I'm confident that my client's going to be happy with this approach, even if it's pretty painful for me. Now, what I found was a ton of overpainting, a ton of fill-in material. And I was able to remove a lot of it, but some of it I have to come back and scrape. With the painting now fully cleaned, I can start preparing it for fill-in and retouching. Because this is raw copper, it will oxidize, and then it will prevent the fill-in material from sticking. So I need to come with a resin that is really receptive to bonding with copper and paint all of the copper areas with this resin. If I don't do this, the fill-in medium will just pop right off and it'll take the retouching with it. So this is a pretty critical step. Now, I don't necessarily want to get this on the surface of the painting. I can remove it, but if I can avoid getting it on the paint layer, well, it's better for me. It's just less work. So I'll continue on all of the areas where there were losses that I discovered after I cleaned the painting and apply this resin. Once the resin is dried, I'm coming back with a modified fill-in material. This is my normal fill-in material, but with some of that resin added in so that it bonds really well to the resin that's already on there. I have had good results using my basic fill-in material on this resin, but I've had great results when mixing a little bit of the resin in. The solvent in the resin softens up the resin that's on the copper, and then it really sticks. So this is a pretty good approach. This painting is really thin, so it doesn't take a lot of fill-in to fill in those voids. But being thin, it's really hard to apply enough without lifting it off. These are my problems, and I'll figure out a solution. Once that fill-in material has dried, I can come in and start removing it. Now again, it's a small painting, so it's relatively easy. There's not a ton of surface area, but I need to be careful because this fill-in is so thin that when I roll over it with my swabs, I don't lift it off. And you can see right there, I just lifted off a ton of fill-in. So I'm gonna have to come back and refill that little spot in. This is going to be a problem on the entire piece, and one of the issues is using a little swab that's wet will lift off that fill-in material when it's so thin. So I'm trying to be judicious about using them. I'm also using a dry sponge as effectively a little sanding block. It's not that abrasive that it's going to scratch the surface of the painting, but it will sand off some of the fill-in material so that I don't have to use my swab and run the risk of pulling it out of those divots. Once that fill-in material has dried, I need to coat this painting with a resin, partially because there's a lot of fill-in and the retouching has a tendency to go matte when applied to the fill-in material, and, well, that's why. You can see the change right away. The colors look radically different once they have this resin applied, and that's going to make retouching much easier. And by easier, I mean, well, marginally easier, because there is a lot of retouching, and this is going to be surprisingly difficult. But I'll figure out a way through it and how to put this piece back together. For such a small piece, that was an impressive amount of retouching that I had to do. That was quite a lot of work. Generally, that's about the limit for how much time I can sit in the chair without going crazy. And now it's time to apply the final varnish. This is going to unify the sheen, protect the painting, and make it just look absolutely gorgeous. It's a multi-step process, and here I'm going to apply it with a bristle brush, just get a coating on, and then I'm going to let it start to dry. Let some of the solvent evaporate from this varnish until it starts to get tacky or sticky or stiff. And then I can come back for the second step. And that involves taking my badger hair brush and tapping on the surface, creating a little stipple effect. And I'm going to be adding micro texture to this varnish as it dries and gets stiff. And that's just going to help diffuse the light and stop the reflections from catching our eye. And you can see here, as I go about this, watch how it changes. Watch how the surface goes from really shiny to, well, not so shiny. And there's the final painting. All flat, with all the creases, ripples, and distortions removed. All clean, with the varnish and overpainting removed. All retouched, varnished again, and ready to go home. This was a pretty interesting project. Very different from many that I work on, but very similar, in fact. The biggest change was dealing with the distorted copper, but that really wasn't that huge of a curveball. More surprising was what I discovered underneath all of that masking varnish, the extensive losses that I then had to retouch. But again, that's kind of part and parcel with what I do here in the studio. But by putting it back together, getting rid of those creases, getting rid of that horrible yellowed masking varnish, and retouching all of those losses, the piece has really come together quite beautifully, and it's brighter and more full of life. We can now even see the halo that was completely obscured before, and the inscription has been restored as well, so now we know exactly who this is. But of course, the biggest change is the lack of distortion. The fact that this piece doesn't look like it was folded and creased ever. And that's precisely what we wanted. Those creases were, well, obviously problematic, but removing them wasn't a foregone conclusion. I wasn't sure that they would fully come out. And while there is a slight scar, I'm very satisfied. Because when it came in, it was completely unviewable. But now, well, we can enjoy the painting, not any of the damage. So now I'm ready to fold this project up and call it done.